All right, so you sent over this article, Risk Response. It's by Pritesh Biswas.
Mm,
And, it got me thinking, we talk about organizations and risk, but I think a lot of times it's kind of a mystery what actually happens once a risk or even an opportunity is identified. Like,
right.
how do they actually decide what to do? So that's what I want to dig into today. What are the ways that organizations respond to risk, once they've actually figured out that it exists?
Yeah, I think that's the really crucial piece, right? Identifying the risk is only step one. So this article, I think, does a great job of taking us through what comes next, how to evaluate those risks, and then ultimately how to figure out the right way to respond.
Yeah. And our mission today is really to extract from this article those core strategies. What are the main approaches and considerations that organizations take when responding to risk? So it's almost like a cheat sheet for how this critical piece of managing an organization actually works. So jumping right in, the first thing the article mentions is that, well, not every identified risk actually requires a response. There's that evaluation phase
Right.
where you figure out, okay, how likely is this to happen? What's the impact going to be? And then kind of weighing that against how much risk the organization is actually comfortable taking on.
Right. And that's where this concept of risk appetite comes in.
Yeah, risk appetite. I feel like it's one of those, businessy words, but the article does a good job, I think, of explaining what that actually means. So it's not just some kind of vague notion. It actually gets into, okay, what is the amount of risk an organization's willing to take in different areas like, financial risk, reputational risk, et cetera. And it gets very specific.
Yeah, and it talks about, where does that risk appetite come from?
Right.
So it highlights that, it's ultimately defined by senior leaders, but it's influenced by all kinds of factors, right? So the organization's culture plays a role. Are they very risk averse or are they more willing to take risks?
Oh.
Stakeholder expectations matter a lot as well.
Like investors and customer.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And then also the regulatory environment, industry standards. All of those things contribute to defining that risk appetite. So, you could imagine a tech startup is going to have very different risk appetite than, let's say, a utility company.
Right. Yeah.
So those are some of the things that feed into defining the risk appetite.
It's almost like, your personal risk appetite. Like, are you going to order the spiciest thing on the menu or are you going to stick with, something safe?
Right, right.
I feel like organizations have the same kind of tendencies.
Absolutely.
Okay. So once an organization has, kind of evaluated the risk and they've weighed it against their appetite, the article goes into, the actual ways to deal with it.
Hmm.
And it introduces the 4 T's for threats.
Yes, the classic 4 T's.
Which is transfer, treat, terminate, and tolerate. And so let's dive into each of those, drawing on what the article has to say about them. So starting with transfer, this is essentially, transferring the risk to someone else, like through insurance.
Right. Insurance is a classic example, and the article gives that one. But also things like outsourcing or using contracts to assign responsibility.
Right. So maybe if you have like a tech company, they might outsource their, server maintenance or something like that.
Exactly.
And then they're transferring the risk of the server going down to, that third party provider.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. And then there's treat, which the article also refers to as mitigate. And so that's where you're actively trying to reduce the likelihood of the risk happening or, the impact that it's going to have if it does. So things like safety measures or employee training.
Exactly. So, for instance, if you're a manufacturing plant and you identify a risk of worker injuries from a particular piece of equipment, you might install safety guards on that equipment, provide better training to employees on how to use it safely.
Right. Yeah.
So, all of those are examples of treating or mitigating that risk.
Okay. And then terminate or avoid, that sounds pretty drastic.
Yeah.
That's where you basically just say, this risk is too much. We are not going to do the thing that's causing it. So changing your strategy or abandoning projects altogether.
Exactly. So, for instance, let's say a pharmaceutical company is developing a new drug, and in clinical trials, they discover really severe side effects.
Oh, yeah.
They might just decide, okay, we're terminating this project completely. We don't want to be associated with that risk.
Right. Makes sense. And then lastly, tolerate, which is also known as accept. And this is where you basically just say, you know what? This risk, it's either too small or the cost of doing something about it is just too high. So you're basically just going to accept that it's there.
Yeah, and I think the key here, and this is something the article emphasizes, is that it's not just about ignoring the risk.
Right.
You still need to monitor it. You still need to have plans in place if that risk escalates.
Right. It's not just like, putting your hat in the sand.
Exactly.
Now, the article brings in figure 1, which is a risk matrix.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to see visually how the likelihood of a risk and the impact kind of leads you to one of those 4 T's.
Right.
So like if it's low likelihood, low impact, well, you're probably going to tolerate that. High likelihood, low impact, treat. Low likelihood, high impact, you want to transfer that risk. And then the one that we all dread, high likelihood, high impact, terminate.
Exactly.
But then the article makes a good point, which is that it's not always as black and white as that.
Right.
Like, just because the risk falls in the terminate box, it doesn't mean it's always feasible to just stop.
Yeah, and it uses the example of firefighters.
Right.
They can't just terminate the risk of going into a burning building.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think the matrix is a good starting point, but there's always nuance, and you have to look at the specific circumstances.
Yeah, and I guess even if you're tolerating a really high risk, like in the case of firefighters, then the monitoring piece becomes even more important.
Absolutely. You need to have very robust contingency plans in place, and you need to be constantly monitoring the situation.
Right. Okay. And then the article goes into a bit more detail on hazard risk response, which is basically just, the 4 T's applied to hazard risks.
Mhm.
And it connects these terms with risk treatment, which is used in standards like BS 31100 and ISO 31000.
Right. Those are the big internationally recognized standards for risk management.
Right.
So that just emphasizes that these are, broadly accepted concepts.
Yes. Yeah, it's not just like some random thing that this author came up with.
Exactly.
And so for each of those 4 T's, it gives a bit more detail, especially in the context of hazards. So for tolerate, it talks about how, that might be appropriate if the risk is already at an acceptable level, or if there's really no way to reduce it further,
Right.
or, if the cost is just disproportionately high. So like, if there's a crack in your driveway, you're probably not going to immediately redo the whole driveway. You're going to wait and monitor it and see how it goes.
Right. Yeah. That's a good example.
And then treat, again, the article points out that that's kind of the most common response to hazards. And that's where you're continuing the activity, but you're putting safeguards in place to try to reduce the risk.
Yeah. Like a construction company requiring everyone on site to wear hard hats.
Oh, yeah, that's a good example.
They're continuing to operate, but they're putting a control measure in place to try to reduce the risk of head injuries.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And then transfer, that's often about using insurance, to cover potential losses.
Exactly. Yeah. So, for instance, a business might have property insurance to cover the risk of their building being damaged by fire or natural disaster.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And then terminate, when it comes to hazards, it's really about, okay, this is just too dangerous.
Mhm.
We need to stop whatever activity is causing this risk.
Right. It might be that a piece of equipment is just fundamentally unsafe,
Right.
and there's really no way to make it safe, so you just have to stop using it.
Yeah. Okay. And then to kind of illustrate this, the article gives some examples of, key dependencies and significant risks for different areas of an organization categorized under what they call the FIRM scorecard.
Right. Firm.
So it's financial, infrastructural, reputational, and marketplace.
Yeah.
And so, it gives some examples. Like under financial, it talks about, availability of funds and internal controls.
Mhm.
And then infrastructure, it talks about the people and, safety standards. And then also the actual physical premises and the risk of them being damaged.
Right.
And then reputational, damage to the brand, regulatory enforcement actions.
Mm.
And then marketplace, they talk about things like, changes to the regulatory environment or the economic health of, whatever area they're operating in.
Right. So it just shows how many different types of risks businesses need to be thinking about.
Yeah. And then it talks about how, you'd assess these risks, you'd put them on that risk matrix, and then you'd use that to figure out, okay, which of the 4 T's is the most appropriate response.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that the article clarified that I thought was helpful is when it's talking about assessing the risk, it's talking about assessing the current risk level,
Mhm.
meaning if there are already controls in place, you're taking that into account.
Right. Right. So you're not starting from scratch. You're saying, okay, given the controls we already have, what's the remaining level of risk?
Right. Yeah. And then it gives a really great example, which is production loss at an oil and gas company.
Mhm.
And it walks through how you could apply, each of the four T's to that specific risk. So for tolerate, it might be, okay, we're going to tolerate, minor production losses because we have to do routine maintenance.
Right.
And then treat could be, okay, we're going to invest in better maintenance programs.
Yeah.
Or we're going to upgrade our technology.
Mhm.
Transfer, that's where you get business interruption insurance. Exactly. And then terminate, in the worst case scenario, maybe you have to relocate your production away from an area that's, prone to hurricanes or something like that.
Right. So it just makes it really clear how these concepts can be applied in a real world situation.
Yeah, exactly. It's so helpful to see that example.
Absolutely.
Okay. So then the article moves into strategic risk response.
Mhm.
And now we're talking about managing risks that could impact the organization's, long-term goals and its competitive position. And so here, the framework expands a little bit from the four T's to also include exploiting opportunities.
Right. Because at the strategic level, you're not just thinking about the downsides. You're also thinking about the potential upsides that might be associated with taking risks.
Right. So like a shift in consumer preferences might be a risk to your existing product line, but it also might be an opportunity to develop something new that's more appealing to those, changing tastes. And then the article also mentions the 4E's framework, which is exist, explore, exploit, and exit. And that's specifically for managing opportunity risks.
Right.
And it links those to, the organization's kind of stage of development.
Yeah. So exist is kind of that initial phase where you're just getting started and there's a lot of uncertainty.
Right.
Explore is about venturing into new areas, potentially with, again, a lot of uncertainty.
Right.
Exploit is about scaling up successful ventures.
Right.
And exit is about knowing when to pull the plug when an opportunity is no longer viable.
Right. And it's interesting, the article mentions that when it comes to these really big strategic decisions, the input from risk management is often less structured than it is with, operational or project level risk management.
Right, which kind of makes sense because those decisions are often made in a more ad hoc way.
Yeah.
But it also highlights the need for more structured and integrated risk management thinking at that level.
Right, because the stakes are really high.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then figure 4 in the article kind of builds on this. It talks about, that high risk, high reward zone.
Mm-hmm.
And it actually introduces an exit option even during the growth phase. So it becomes like a 5E's model.
Right, which just emphasizes that even when things are going well, you always need to be monitoring the situation and be prepared to exit if the risks start to outweigh the potential rewards.
Right, yeah. And then it talks about some specific strategies for responding to opportunities,
Mm-hmm.
like enhance, exploit, ignore, and share. So, just like with threats, there's a kind of a framework for thinking about how to respond to opportunities as well.
Exactly. You need to have a structured approach to managing both the upsides and the downsides.
Right. Okay, so now that we've talked about how organizations respond to risks, I think we need to circle back to that central concept of risk appetite.
Yes, risk appetite.
Because, all of these strategies, they really rely on a clear understanding of what the organization's risk appetite actually is.
Exactly. If you don't know what level of risk you're comfortable with, then it's really hard to make informed decisions about how to respond.
Right. And the article gives a really nice overview of what risk appetite means. It pulls definitions from various sources like ISO Guide 73 and the Orange Book, and kind of brings them all together to say, okay, risk appetite is essentially about how much risk you're willing to take to achieve your objectives.
Mm-hmm.
And it outlines some key characteristics of risk appetite. So first, it needs to be aligned with the overall business strategy.
Right. You can't have a risk appetite that's completely disconnected from what you're trying to achieve as an organization.
Right. It also varies by risk type. So, your appetite for financial risk might be different from your appetite for reputational risk.
Exactly.
It's dynamic. It changes over time as the organization changes and as the external environment changes. And it needs to consider all stakeholders.
Right. You need to be thinking about your investors, your customers, your employees, and all of those perspectives need to be factored into your risk appetite.
Right. And then it gives some really helpful examples of like high, moderate, modest, and low risk appetites specifically for an oil and gas company. And it just shows, the difference between like aggressively exploring in politically unstable regions versus focusing solely on, low risk, well-established areas.
Right. It just makes it really clear how different risk appetites translate into concrete decisions.
Yeah. And then it touches on the link between risk appetite and risk criteria.
Mm-hmm.
So, risk criteria are those benchmarks that you use to evaluate whether a risk is significant or not.
Right. Yeah.
And it points out the difference between like your short-term risk appetite, like in a specific situation,
Mhm.
and then your broader, longer-term risk attitude or criteria.
Exactly. So you might be willing to take on a little bit more risk in a specific situation if the potential rewards are high enough.
Right.
But that doesn't necessarily change your overall risk tolerance as an organization.
Right. And one of the interesting things that the article brings up is this idea that, organizations don't usually just come out and say, okay, we have an appetite for this much risk.
Right.
But rather, it's often a result of the decisions that they make.
Yeah.
So their risk appetite and their exposure to risk is kind of a byproduct of the things they're choosing to do, like entering a new market or launching a new product.
Exactly. They're not necessarily saying we want to take on this much risk.
Right.
They're saying we want to achieve this objective, and this is the level of risk that's associated with that.
Right. Okay, so now we need to talk about a few more related concepts. So there's risk capacity, which is the maximum amount of risk the organization can actually handle.
Mhm.
Risk exposure, which is the total amount of risk it's currently facing.
Right.
And then risk appetite is kind of the leadership's willingness to actually put resources at risk.
Exactly. So capacity is about what you can handle, exposure is about what you're actually facing, and appetite is about what you're comfortable with.
Right, yeah. And the article emphasizes the importance of having those three things aligned.
Mhm.
Because if they're not, you could end up taking on too much risk.
Right. Or you could be too risk averse and miss out on opportunities.
Yeah. And it differentiates between risk appetite and risk attitude.
Mhm.
So risk appetite is seen as more of an organizational thing.
Right.
It's strategic, it's formal, it's relatively stable,
Yeah.
whereas risk attitude is more individual or team-based.
Mhm.
It's behavioral and it can fluctuate more.
Right. So you might have a formal risk appetite statement that says, we're comfortable with this much risk.
Mm-hmm.
But the actual behavior of people within the organization might be different.
Right. Okay, so now let's talk about how these concepts interact.
Okay.
The article has this great visual and it shows these lines representing like risk appetite, risk exposure, and risk capacity. And it has shaded areas to indicate like, levels of risk. So the blue line is your appetite. It's pretty consistent. The orange line is your exposure. That one fluctuates up and down.
Mhm.
And then the green line is your capacity. That's like the maximum you can tolerate.
Right.
And then it has red for overexposure
Mhm.
and yellow for controlled risk. And it's just such a clear visual way to see how those things relate to each other.
Yeah, it really helps you to understand whether your current risk-taking is aligned with your appetite and your capacity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it talks about, how a risk-averse organization might view this.
Mm.
They're very comfortable when they're in that green zone, where their exposure is low.
Right.
But as they get closer to the blue and the yellow, they get a little more cautious.
Mhm.
And then that red zone, that's like panic time.
Yeah, that's where they really start to get worried.
And they tend to have a higher risk capacity, so they have more wiggle room.
Mm.
And then it contrasts that with a risk-aggressive organization. They have a much bigger comfort zone.
Right.
So there's like less red on their graph,
Mm-hmm.
but they might be more likely to bump up against or even exceed their capacity.
Right, because they're willing to take on more risk.
Okay, so all of this leads to the question of how do organizations actually figure out what their risk appetite is?
Right.
And then how do they use it in practice?
Yeah.
And the article says, it involves judgment at all levels of the organization,
Mm-hmm.
from the board down to the individual employees.
Right.
And it brings up this really interesting challenge for risk management professionals, which is that organizations don't go out seeking risk.
Right.
They're going after their business objectives.
Mm-hmm.
And the level of risk is often a byproduct of those decisions.
Exactly. So it's not like they're saying, we want to take on this much risk.
Right.
It's more like, we want to achieve this goal,
Mhm.
and this is the level of risk that's associated with that.
Right. And so the risk appetite kind of needs to be figured out in that context.
Yeah.
And it uses this analogy, which I thought was really great. Like if you have someone who loves, extreme sports,
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't necessarily mean they're reckless in all areas of their life.
Right.
So the same is true with organizations.
Mhm.
They might be willing to take big risks in some areas,
Right.
but very conservative in others.
Exactly.
Okay, so now we need to talk about a really important distinction, which is the difference between risk and uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
And so the article defines risk as something measurable.
Right.
You can estimate the potential loss or gain,
Yeah.
and you have some idea of the probabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Uncertainty, on the other hand, is where you don't have that information.
Right. It's the unknown
When
unknowns.
the outcomes are unpredictable,
Mhm.
and you really can't assign probabilities.
Exactly.
And so the article points out that these require different approaches.
Hmm.
So you can develop mitigation plans for risks. Right.
But with uncertainty, you often need more flexible adaptive strategies.
Yeah, like scenario planning or contingency planning.
Right.
Eh,
And then the article has this figure that shows, kind of the range of outcomes
Mm.
for hazard risks, control risks, and opportunity risks.
Right.
And it shows those 95% certainty lines.
Mm-hmm.
And it just really illustrates that spectrum of predictability.
Exactly.
And then it says that, your total risk appetite can be seen as the sum of your acceptable hazard exposure,
Mm-hmm.
the level of control risks that you're willing to accept,
Right.
and then the investments you make in opportunities.
Yeah.
So it's kind of bringing it all together.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now let's talk about risk appetite statements,
Mm-hmm.
or RAS.
RAS.
And so these are those formal documents that actually say, this is how much risk we're willing to accept.
Mm-hmm.
And it points out that, they often include a range, which is called the risk tolerance range.
Mm-hmm. And that defines the acceptable variation around a particular objective.
So it's not just a single number,
Right.
it's a range.
And the article emphasizes that risk appetite statements are really important
Mm-hmm.
because they help ensure consistency in decision making.
Exactly.
And they can also drive strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, in banking, the risk appetite statement is often a key driver of the bank's overall strategy.
Right.
Whereas for other organizations, it might be more of a planning tool,
Mm-hmm.
or it might act as like operational constraints.
Right.
But ideally, it should be all three of those things.
Yeah.
And then it talks about the stages involved in actually developing a risk appetite statement.
Mm-hmm.
So first, you need to identify the stakeholders.
Right.
Then you define your current risk exposure.
Mm-hmm.
You establish your desired level of risk.
Yeah.
And you set those acceptable levels of volatility, which are called your tolerances.
Mm-hmm.
And then you reconcile your appetite and your tolerances with your actual exposure.
Right. And then you formalize the statement and you communicate it.
Exactly.
And it stresses that the risk appetite statement should be aligned with the organization's risk classification framework.
Mm-hmm.
And then it gives some really great examples. So it gives examples of risk appetite statements for an oil and gas company.
Mm-hmm.
And it also gives examples for a manufacturing organization.
Oh.
And it shows, high appetite, moderate appetite, modest appetite, low appetite. And it links those to the strategic objectives.
Yeah,
And it's just really helpful to see how that's actually done.
absolutely.
And then at the end, the article talks about personal risk appetite.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I love this because it brings it all back to, us as individuals.
Right.
And it talks about how, our lifestyle choices are often based on our risk attitude,
Mm-hmm.
our appetite for risk,
Yeah,
our exposure to risk,
Mm.
and our capacity for risk.
exactly.
So that gives examples like, family history of health problems.
Mm-hmm. Our habits, our diet, exercise, whether we smoke, all of those things.
Right.
And it says that we often have this preference for like immediate, positive, and certain outcomes,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to like, the uncertain future benefits.
Right. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush.
Exactly. And then it points out that our risk attitude varies by risk type.
Mm-hmm.
So we might be very risk averse in some areas of our life,
Right.
but very risk seeking in others.
Exactly.
And it acknowledges that it's hard to actually define our risk appetite.
Mm-hmm.
But it says that having a clear risk attitude can help.
Right. So if you know how you generally feel about risk, then that can guide your decisions.
And then it ends with this really nice summary of like the overall approach to risk management.
Mm-hmm.
So it says it's about embracing strategic opportunities,
Mm-hmm.
managing tactical uncertainties,
Right.
mitigating operational hazards,
Mm-hmm.
and minimizing compliance risks.
Yeah. So it's a very comprehensive view of risk management.
Yeah. So overall, our deep dive into this article, Risk Response,
Mm-hmm.
we've really highlighted some key takeaways like risk appetite,
Mm-hmm.
how important it is to understand that and how it guides all the other decisions.
Exactly.
We talked about all the different strategies, the 4 T's for threats,
Mm-hmm.
the 4 or even 5 S for opportunities,
Right.
the importance of knowing your risk tolerance, your exposure, and your capacity,
Mm-hmm.
and then also that difference between risk and uncertainty.
Exactly.
So I hope that our listeners are now walking away with a much clearer understanding of how all of this works.
Yeah, I think so. It's been a really comprehensive overview.
So, thinking about everything that we've talked about today and all the different aspects of risk management,
Hmm.
what do you think is like the one area where organizations tend to struggle the most?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think,
When they're actually trying to put all of this into practice.
yeah, that's a really interesting question to think about. I think
Yeah. Something for our listeners to ponder.
definitely.
Well, that's it for our deep dive today into risk response, extracting those key insights